Hello there. Welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel, a show where we dive into the weird and unusual albums of all sorts, right? Today we are in for an incredibly unusual episode, I feel like. I genuinely have no idea how this is going to turn out, but I'm genuinely very excited to present this today. This episode has been an incredibly long time coming, and to be fair, this wasn't even requested as such, but when I was introduced to this album through a comment on the very first Weird Music episode, I was enthralled by it, I was engrossed, pulled in, and I really wanted to talk about it on the channel, as it's, without a doubt, one of the most ambitious experimental albums I've ever come across. So, this album, it has, I would say, some notoriety amongst the internet, definitely in part, to its incredibly long runtime of around 7 hours and 20 minutes. This is just, it's incredible, and I'm very excited to talk about it. So today, I present to you Daughter of Darkness by Natural Snow Buildings. Right, so, yep, this is going to be a really weird episode then. I genuinely don't know how long this video is going to be, as I say this, or, I don't know how it's going to turn out the editing and stuff, but hey, that's what makes it interesting to me. I'm excited to see what this is going to turn into. But why is this going to be so long, though? Why is that? Well, it's because essentially I've written my thoughts about every single song on this album, each and every one of its 18 tracks, I think it is. And this is the longest script I've ever written for any episode of Weird Music, even longer than our Jingle Cats episode. So yeah, this is going to be weird. Before we dive into it all, we must ask ourselves the question, who are Natural Snow Buildings? Well, Natural Snow Buildings, sometimes abbreviated to NSB, is an experimental, drone, psychedelic folk lo-fi duo from Paris, France, consisting of members Mehdi Amazain and Solange Goularte. Or Goularte? I don't know how it's said, I'm sorry about that. So as well as being in Natural Snow Buildings, both have performed solo music as well under the monikers of Twin Sister Moon and Isengrind, respectively. And so having operated, since around 97, 98, I want to say, Amazain and Goularte have pushed out this incredible discography of music under the name of Natural Snow Buildings, and created this incredible sonic palette that utilizes a great number of pedals, EBOs, which is an absolute favorite of mine, and various woodwind percussions and vocalizations, essentially. And they have this incredible discography, and this rather eclectic discography, I might add. It mostly features these incredibly long semi-improvisational compositions. They just let their creative muse guide them, and they just explore the capabilities of all their instruments and their pedals, and just off they go. They do their own thing, and as a result, you get this phenomenal music that's and an incredible discography that's also absurdly difficult to get a hold of, as the vast majority of all this stuff has been self-released in incredibly limited quantities. So if you own something by Natural Snow Buildings, then pat yourself on the back, you're incredibly lucky, I would say. So let's ask ourselves another question. What is Daughter of Darkness? Well, Daughter of Darkness is the incredible long-form album experience comprising a vast number of improvisational recordings all together into this one cohesive album experience. And originally self-released on cassette by the band, the most well-known and loved version of Daughter of Darkness is arguably the re-release by Bada Bing Records, which compiled the album onto 8 LPs into this one massively beautiful package that I would say is perhaps up there with the original release of F-sharp A-sharp Infinity by Godspeed You Black Emperor as being, one of the best vinyl releases ever released. Arguably I'd say, you look at all what you get in this package. You've got these beautiful paintings from Solange herself that, and all these vinyls and stuff. It's truly beautiful, and it's a wonderfully aesthetic physical release, I think. As well though, when Bada Bing Records released it, they even released it as well as a rather minimalist 6-disc version of the album, packaged in paper sleeves with no album artwork, which is a rather odd way to release it, I think, but it gives it this odd sense of mystery, I would feel, and intrigue as well, actually, which I like, to be fair. If you know this channel, I like, weird, unusual intrigues and things. But in any case, the compact disc version of orders all of the tracks into the very same order as the digital version of the album, which is the album version we'll be looking at today. And yep, it compiled 18 tracks across 6 discs, creating this 7-hour and 20-minute album odyssey that is, well, unlike anything I feel. So let's dive into it one by one then, shall we? So this colossal album opens up with the title track of Daughter of Darkness. 14 minutes of experimental drone folk to establish everything. And so I think it's worth mentioning this here, that Natural Snow Buildings are big fans of horror movies, and maybe cinema in general, actually. And as a result, a bunch of their tracks are named after movies, And it makes perfect sense, to be fair. It's something I've done myself, in terms of creating experimental instrumental music, just name it after a film, because it kind of expresses the same vibes, if that makes sense. And so Daughter of Darkness, it's most likely named after the 1948 film of the same name, which is apparently a rather dark and macabre film that's very unsettling, which makes a lot of sense as to why this track was named after it. And this is a brilliant mood setter for the monumental experience we are about to undergo. You've got this slow fade in as you're suddenly greeted by an almost overload of loops and, guitar strings that are bouncing and warbling with these delay effects, backed up by these incredibly unsettling drones and screeching guitars, that begin as almost single notes before expanding into these more elongated drones. And immediately, this track sets so much of the tone for the entire album, an experience that's going to be incredibly foreboding, full of fear, uncertainty, and just unsettlement in general, just horror and macabreness, right? And, especially with those rattles of percussion that are punctuating over the top of many of these drones, it creates this incredibly uncomfortable listening experience, I feel, With me especially, I just feel this rising level of anxiety and fear. It just fills me up inside, And the more the track progresses, the less, the more you just get sucked in and absorbed by the whole composition, and the less you realise how much time has actually gone by with this thing, as elements and motifs just glide into the picture just effortlessly. And you get so many elements at the forefront, whilst in the background, these Ebo guitars just push and push consistently throughout the entire thing, before they start to come to the forefront of the composition itself, where they're just screeching and whining with this really unholy and unsettling experience, And it's roughly 8 minutes in, so many of these opening instruments and motifs have faded away into the distance, or into obscurity, I would say, leaving up with these looped Ebo guitar drones, that start stretching out as far as they possibly can, before they themselves, start to fade into the quiet, and then you just get a reprise of the very sounds that opened up this entire album. And here though, like, you get some very interesting effects on the guitars. You're sort of getting this kind of wah-wah effect, I assume from a wah pedal, right? I don't really know how else to actually describe it, but there's something very interesting about it before it then transitions seamlessly into these longer forming droning notes. And it's a brilliant cooldown from that colossal build-up of layers and drones that you've been bombarded with for the opening track, you know? Those EBOs, they then just continue to play on as everything slowly fades out into that peculiar silence. And man, like, you're kind of just stunned by the whole thing by the end of it, you know? It's a brilliant opening for this album, as it perfectly establishes so much of what we're going to be experiencing across this entire length of time. Foreboding and intimidating drones that pile up on top of each other, layer after layer, and just throwing you into this foreboding and terrifying world. So, moving right along, this album, you know, certainly does this a lot, no doubt about it, but you get track 2, Satanic Demona Part 1. And this one kind of opens up really weirdly with, like, I would describe it as a kind of flamenco-flared acoustic guitar playing, if that makes sense, you know? It gives the whole opening a very folky feel, if that makes sense, you know, and like, a lot of them kind of establish this kind of folk notion, if that makes sense. It's very unusual, but very interesting. But once again, slowly building it all up though, layer after layer, introducing new elements and ideas until that very peculiar acoustic style, you know, is suddenly being bombarded by the most intimidating and darkest sounding drones. And this one, it's such a slow burner of a track. I feel as though it's the start of the start of this actual track is something of a misnomer, despite the actual name, you know, perhaps giving, you know, away something to the darkness of it, if that makes sense, you know. It doesn't start off as dark as it should do, but then it gets dark, if that makes sense. And as it progresses onward and onward, more of that darkness, that anguish, it just seems to be adding itself into the mix, though. And what I love in this one, though, is you get these incredibly foreboding, droning vocalizations, you know, and it just feels so ritualistic, and just, it gives me the sense of, you know, a group maybe, just trying to summon up this intimidating figure from another world, you know. And it just builds up and builds up until suddenly, once again, all those layers fade away and you're just left with droning EBOs again. And there's a phenomenal part though where the guitars screech with such an unholy effect though. It's sounding like the summoned figure is just an abhorrent creature that cannot exist in this plane of existence. And that is until all the drones start to build up again into this really loud, tumultuous ending, until it all just beautifully segues into Satanic Demona Part 2. And this is where those drones continue to ring out before you're greeted with a reintroduction of that acoustic guitar again. And it starts to strum a melody whilst, you know, the EBOs continue to screech and whine with those reverb and delay effects, you know, the pedals just sending the tones through just on a holy racket, essentially. And what I love on this one, though, is how very early on, you're getting this very peculiar percussion that, you know, it gives it all this very tribalistic and ritualistic feeling. And it just builds up so beautifully, though, especially as more and more percussive elements seem to throw themselves into the mix, you know, joining those beautiful drones into this really terrifying elegy. And the percussion, it gives it this peculiar pacing, though, that it kind of pushes it in a very weird and peculiar way, giving it this oddly rigid structure that somehow works alongside these really long abstract drones that occupy so much of the track, of course. And to me, I'm given this sense, you know, of a procession marching through the bleakest, darkest night, carrying with them this untold, indescribable horror. And yet despite it all, despite the anguish and the despair, you know, there's something truly captivating about it as it all proceeds past, you know, just hypnotizing you and forcing you to just walk alongside their unholy parade. until it all just fades away once again, the chanting, the percussion, leaving us those drones that continue to intertwine amongst themselves. And it's so peculiar here, as it all fades away, you get these woodwind instruments that just drone and drone, that become more of a focal point, if that makes sense, before the shaking of the bells acts as percussion again, and you're given a really peculiar motif, that feels like the aftermath of all the chaos that we have just been witness to. But it's a beautiful motif, and it's a lovely melody that plays right to the very ending of this track, backed up by the most powerful building of droning layers, of course, until they too fade away, of course. And it leaves only the strumming of acoustic guitars, to close out the track. And man, it's a phenomenal experience to behold, and I find this one to be truly existential in terms of how the whole thing just makes me feel when I experience it, And I'll be honest, I feel like, my words already have failed to do justice to both parts 1 and 2, but it's so difficult to describe a lot of this existentialism into words, but man, it's truly, the fear and the power of it all is truly something to behold. It really gets to you in this really unusual way. It's phenomenal stuff, phenomenal stuff. So, after the powerful and mind-expanding experience of Satanic Demona Parts 1 and 2, we're given one of the few short tracks on this album as a closer for what is Disc 1 of Daughter of Darkness. We get Cure, which I believe roughly translates to curse, I think. I'm not too sure on that though. But yeah, being around 6 minutes and 15 seconds in length, this is the third shortest track on the album. And yet, as short as this is, it still comes across as one of the most intimidating, emotional and cathartic experiences across the whole album. Much of this track is just punctuated by the ever-droning guitars and vocals that just stretch out as far as they possibly can, and it just leaves behind this wake of destruction in its path. And to me, it's like looking out upon a battlefield after the end of an incredibly bloody match, with there being nothing but death for miles and miles around. There's just something so anguished and full of mourning in this track, especially when those vocals just continue to ring out, for the entire length of the track. And what I love about this one is, even though it's arguably a short track for natural snowbuilding, it still manages to build up to that frenzied turmoil, that overloads and bombards you with just pure drones, until you just get a sudden ending. Bam, and it's over. And so we move on to Disc 2 of Daughter of Darkness, and this opens up with Carnal Flowers. And this one starts off with this deluge of layers there. You're getting this almost spectral drum beat, that push forward the proceedings, these haunting vocal melodies that climbing and twisting around each other, as well as the rattling of bells and chimes that add to the general ambience. And this track, it's the second shortest one on the whole album, and with that in mind, I feel like, it can kind of be forgotten amongst the barrage of drones you're getting across the whole album, but it's still an incredibly interesting track nonetheless, and this one has this incredibly melancholy edge to it though, as it just pushes along, And I'd say, it's actually one of my favourites, especially how the woodwinds sound. They just all push and collide in this tragically beautiful fashion before they just fade it all out into beautiful silence. It's a lovely composition on this one, truly beautiful, truly beautiful. But from here, we move on to what is essentially the longest single composition on the entirety of Daughter of Darkness. Her face is not her real face. The 46.5-minute masterclass of tension-building drones. This one, my goodness, this is a truly existential experience. I still like it. What a track on this one. It essentially opens up with this beautiful acoustic melody, backed up by vocalizations, and that they already start to establish an uncomfortable and darkly foreboding scene, no doubt. And as it all continues to progress, you're given those quintessential layers of abstract guitar lines, both acoustic and electronic, that just start to build and build. And this one I find to be incredibly intimidating to listen to. I would argue, this is perhaps one of the most intimidating tracks on this album. There's a whole bunch of them, but this one really gets to me for some reason. And especially in how it's all starting off though. There's just something so sinister and moody about it. It's so dark, as though you're trying, as though we're going to be building up towards something truly terrifying. And of course, the more it progresses, the more those layers start to pour on top of each other though, pushing it further and further into the darkness until you just get this deluge of drones and noises that further pushes that intimidation to absurdly uncomfortable levels. And after that though, natural snow buildings let so many of those layers fade out, the acoustics, the vocalizations, until all that is left are just these absurdly terrifying drones that screech and whine over the top of each other, before those too end up fading away. Just to give the track room to breathe amongst the chaos we have just experienced. And this is something we're going to see so much of this album. They build up layers, they bring them back down and build them up and stuff like that. And it's amazing how consistently they can do this every time. It's using all of those looper pedals to just build layers and take them away. It's phenomenal stuff. With this one though, after it all fades away a bit, the acoustics, come back in, the vocalizations again. But this time, it turns into something else entirely, as it all just clips and buzzes amongst the recording itself though, and it creates this oddly spectacular setting for the song, There's acoustic, they just continue to push it all through though, backed up by the occasional drone that continues to screech in such a terrifying way, before the woodwinds and that tribalistic drums that we should no doubt be used to by now come back, ready to push this song further upstream toward that chaotic darkness. And goodness me, the build-up is so slow, but it's so incredible when it reaches those tumultuous levels of overload. It just collides together in such brilliant fashion. And what I find interesting is that, once again, in this very same song, they let those layers, build back up again towards another tumultuous level, and then you're given the experience of slow build to chaos, to decline, to slow build to the chaos, and decline again, etc., etc., etc. Letting it build, fade away, build and fade away, and it's a truly unique experience, of a song that is. It's such a behemoth to approach, but not only as a standalone track, but as a part of this whole album experience, no doubt. This one truly stands out as one of the most intimidating and chaotic tracks on it, but I feel like it's such a central piece to so much of what's being presented here, if that makes sense, It's so noisy, loud and chaotic, and it just becomes this sonic overload that it just inspires fear and terror into my very core, if that makes sense, Truly stands out across the whole Daughter of Darkness, I feel. But moving on though, we get another rather unusual one. We're going to be saying that a lot, I feel, but it's in a good way, of course. They're all unusual in good ways. But we get a body double, which is. It might be named after the 1984 film by Brian De Palma, which is apparently a film that pays homage to Alfred Hitchcock films, which, kind of makes sense with the whole horror macabre thing, right? Maybe, I don't know though, I don't know. But this one, it opens up with an almost whimsical guitar line that's really fuzzy and compressed, And the lo-fi recording gives it this really peculiar flair as you're just greeted with the gentle twinkling and rattling of various percussive instruments. And as it slowly progresses though, you're getting this acoustic riff, starting to enter the fray as gentle vocalizations float between the various layers of instrumentals. And I have to say, the vocals are perhaps some of my favourite parts of the various loops you're getting in these drones. They add such mystery, intrigue and character to the very songs themselves that it all just, once again, builds up and up and up, adding layer upon layer until it becomes just a cataclysmic overload of instruments and vocals. And this one though, it all just beautifully intertwines in such a wonderfully peculiar way, and it creates something that's, weirdly delightful, but kind of odd and peculiar at the same time. But it's perhaps one of the nicest moments on this album though. It's a track that seems to arguably step away, from the absolute terror of those overloading drones and stray into territory that arguably is a bit more approachable and comfortable, whilst still retaining all of those mysterious qualities, no doubt. And to me, this is kind of like the Pink Courtesy Phone thing we discussed during their episode, where you're getting equal parts of unsettlement and delight though, intertwining effortlessly and seamlessly into one cohesive track. And especially as this track reaches the end though, you're getting this, it all just feels like it's built up to this tumultuous finisher. And yet there's something so beautiful and pretty about it, and as a result, I'd say this is one of my favourites across the whole album experience, especially after, the incredibly intimidating and foreboding experiences of some of the previous tracks. Having these, kind of gentler moments, gentler within the context of the album, I would say, but having these gentler moments on the album just offers a bit of respite for us, It's odd, but very interesting, very interesting. And so we move on to what is track 8 of Daughter of Darkness. We find ourselves with the shortest track on the entire album experience, the 5-minute track of The Source. And this one, it's another track that ties into so many of the key themes, concepts and emotions that the entire album is presenting, of course, It's a short drone of vocalizations, acoustic improvisation and, the rattling and ringing of various percussive instruments, And I find this one, to be one of the few moments of true respite on the album, And despite the incredibly sad and melancholy nature of this particular track, I feel it's gentle enough to allow us just a small moment of rest on this whole album experience, Especially with those droning vocalizations. They're so oddly beautiful amongst the incredibly sad and mournful instruments behind it all. And I love this sparse guitar line in this one. It just hangs around almost in the background there, pushing it just a little bit. But mostly, it just adds to the incredibly sad weight that the whole track is carrying with itself, just slowly pulling itself along, essentially. And so, we move on to disc 3 of Daughter of Darkness. And this one opens up with Sangre Part 1. And so they're split into 2 parts, of course, Sangre. This track is more than likely named after the 1989 film of the same name by Alejandro Jodorowsky, a surreal avant-garde horror film. That, like any Jodorowsky film, is essentially super weird, right? But for this one, you're given that quintessential natural snow buildings opener, though, or at least what we might expect from the band after what we've, already heard so far, if that makes sense, It's a sudden immediate start of percussive elements, creating that tribalistic war dance, as the voices vocalize and intertwine into each other seamlessly, just blending together to create this confusingly dark and foreboding experience, And so much of this one, though, just feels dominated by that constant percussion, just rattling away in the background as it pushes and pushes it alongside those slowly building drums. And in the background, just rattling away into that percussion, It's so interesting because it creates such a foreboding presence to this one. Something so ominous, so terrifying and horrific. as though we're slowly working our way into the depths of hell itself or something, just somewhere truly terrifying. And I feel like so much of the terrifying presence of this one is definitely in part to that consistent drum pattern that is just dominating so much of the recording on this one. No, it just never lets up, as it just loops over and over in the background, and the consistent build-up of drone after drone after drone. And this one really feels like going insane, I feel, as it just progresses further and further until finally the percussion lets up, as you're just left standing there witnessing the sheer horror presented by the now tumultuous drones. And then a gentle acoustic guitar strumming pattern, comes in to fade this one out. And it brings us straight into Sangre Part 2. It picks up exactly where its predecessor left off. Though I have to say, I find it interesting, at the very end of Part 1, you hear the strum of that acoustic guitar, assumed acoustic, I assume it is, I'm not actually 100% sure. But yet that strumming doesn't carry directly into the opening of Part 2. Instead, you're almost just given a reprise of the terrifying and tumultuous drones that just continue to screech and whine in such an unholy existential manner. And to me, once again, it feels like witnessing the terrible aftermath of such catastrophic and terrifying events, watching it all be consumed in this ever-growing darkness with no respite in sight at all, as you're just forced deeper and deeper into that incredibly dark miasma, as though we're eventually consumed wholly by the entire thing. This one, though, I find to be such an existential experience to listen to, though, especially following on from that first half of Sangre Part 1 as well. It just feels like the entire thing has continued to build and build up, though, from what the first half has established, building up those layers of drones, forcing it further and further into the darkness. And it genuinely becomes really scary at times, I feel, And it's perhaps why at around 9 minutes in, I think it is, when it all starts to fade and subside, it doesn't actually feel peaceful. Those emotions that have been risen up in our very bodies, they have yet to subside in any way. And so they continue to remain as you find yourself in the entire final stretch of this composition, which it seems to continue certain droning elements in the background, whilst attempting to rebuild the entire experience back up from the dirt, bringing new vocal layers that drone on insistently across the swirling miasma of instrumentals. And it's the final section, though, of this. It brings us back to such a terrifying presence of screaming, discordant notes that whine with such phenomenal feedback. And it's though, after the horrifying and terrific event that we have undergone up to this point, it's still not over, as out of the dirt and the ashes, stumbling to get up, rises the most terrifying image, presented to us as this deluge of noisy feedback. And what amazes me is the consistent build-up of noise and drones just layering on top of each other right up towards the very final seconds of this particular composition. And man, it just leaves you in this terrifying awe as you try to comprehend what the hell has happened here. And yet, there's still another track on this disc. We directly move on to 1,000 Demons Invocation, following directly from the onslaught of Sangre. And this immediately opens up with some incredibly fuzzy and distorted electric guitars. And so I'll mention here, when this album was first recommended to me in the comments for the video on Shalabi Effect's self-titled, our commenter mentioned that they were reminded of natural snow buildings when hearing Shalabi Effect. And I think, this track is perhaps what was coming to their mind, as this one, kind of gave me those similar vibes, especially for the opening of Oral Florida, that just whining of electric guitar, just screeching a buzzed out feedback, intertwined with this really peculiar acoustic riff, though, that it doesn't actually sound like an acoustic guitar, but some sort of traditional folk instrument. It might be an acoustic guitar, but still, I don't know. I have no idea, I'm sorry. But what I love on this one, there's such a free-form abstraction, to this one, I feel, which just proceeds into this chaotic deluge, with the very plucking of that instrument, whatever it may be, pushing the whole track along, giving it this really peculiar folky feel, of course. And of course, that phenomenal build-up of drones occupies the background, as well as the appearance of EBOs here and there. So much of the drones are presented to us from EBOs and stuff. It just creates such a terrifying racket. I just love it so much. But it all just fits so comfortably into that, that swirling miasma that the track offers, though. And I love how this one just becomes such a frenzy and tumultuous experience. It just progresses onwards and onwards, and how big and huge those drones become. Weirdly enough, certain sections of this one, it just reminds you of the kind of sheer raw power you get when listening to Colin Stetson, where drones just scream and roar with this terrific volume. And what amazes me is how all that momentum, it's continued for like another 10 minutes or so before we fall back into another meditational chant of feedback, percussion and droning vocals towards the final third of this track. And it colludes some incredibly beautiful vocals from Solange towards the very final minutes that create this really beautiful musical passage. And to me, this track conjures up an image of an occult trying to resurrect the souls of the underworld, with the middle section being the awful, terrifying visions of such an unholy event, before you just get a dance around the ritual of all the demons that have been dragged up from the underworld. So dark and macabre, but it's to be expected by now. Like, so much of this album's dark and macabre, and that's what makes it brilliant, And so, we move on to disc 4, and this one opens up with Slaves for the Afterlife. So, across the whole Daughter of Darkness album, this is perhaps one of the tracks that really stands out to me for some reason. And so, story time. I distinctly remember when I first listened to this album, or one of the first times I listened to it. Our band had just done a concert, I believe, and I listened to the album on the way home in the Uber, as I often do. I decided not to listen to La Bradford. I listened to Natural Snow Buildings, and when we got back and got into bed, left the album playing as I was trying to go to sleep. Why? I don't know. Don't ask me why. I just decided to. And somehow, listening to Natural Snow Buildings' Daughter of Darkness, I did actually fall asleep. But I distinctly remember waking up as Slaves for the Afterlife was playing. And it led to this, fantastic yet terrifying existential experience, as you're just groggily waking up, and then the awareness of the horror and terror just, just occurs to you, if that makes sense. And it's a weird story, but it's kind of funny, but I just thought it was worth mentioning, Anyway, though, this track, there's so much presence as it opens up. You're getting these really peculiar rattles of the instruments themselves, sort of stuttering on certain notes, whilst in the background, a myriad of vocal drones and guitars just start swirling around. And I'll say here, for some reason or other, I love how Mere Armazian's vocals sound, It's a somewhat low and moody vocal drone, And it continues along in this fashion for such a long while before, it just gives us time to let the drones, just start to pull us into that dark, foreboding landscape, of course, before you get the very ominous thumping of percussion that's not really following any specific kind of beat, but it's just thumping away like the hammering on a door in the dead of nighttime, before you then just get a tapping and rattling of various percussion that sounds like the hooves of many animals just strutting along the place. And for me, it creates this incredibly ominous experience that literally sends a shiver down my spine every single time I hear it. But I like that it does that, though. I like how, this track is perfectly expressing so concisely these really dark, foreboding emotions and such a terrifying atmosphere. And that when you listen to it, you're just dragged into that and you feel it so viscerally almost. But yeah, like so many of these tracks though, build up of drones, screaming, roaring, shouting, and crying into the nether as the drone, as the drone screech in the background before it just, once again, it dies away and just lets a single Ebo drone, now accompanied by an incredible little acoustic riff of chords, that instantly changes the atmosphere. Like, it's still dark and foreboding, but man, like, something different is happening, and that's terrifying. But yeah, like, so many of the tracks, there's, it's the feeling, it just conjures up the idea of procession marching through, and once the acoustic riff launches off the second half, it just, for me, I'm just given this image of like the longest queue of like hooded figures, marching slowly like through the cracks of a mountainscape for some reason, this dark and harrowing landscape. And I just see it every single time I hear it for some reason. They just vocalize basically. And you get a brilliant tempo though being established here in this track. It's just enough to move it along without it rushing it, or letting it drag in any particular way. But to continue on though, you get another brilliant vocal passage on this one, which I assume is from Nede, or at least I assume so, before himself and Solange intertwine their own droning vocals together. And what you end up getting this beautifully ghostly effects amongst the very instrumentals. And once again, truly terrifying, but there is something so beautiful about it though, like so truly brilliant, and as a result, this one is, without a doubt in my mind, one of the strongest tracks on this whole album experience. It stands out to me for so many reasons, I feel, but man, it fills me with so much fear though, but I love it for that, I love it for that. But moving on, we end up at Black Pastures. This track starts off with no warning of any kind. It just throws us into a miasma of woodwind loops backed up by very drony vocals again. And the guitars slowly establish much more of the atmosphere, adding up layer upon layer, within the very drones themselves. But a particular highlight, are the vocals once again, there's such a delightful tone to them, as they just intertwine wonderfully into the music itself. And as you get those layers being established, they just allow themselves to just loop themselves this peculiar knot, And then you get, peculiar acoustic instruments adding upon layers, with these lo-fi percussive rattles, before it just becomes so much louder and intense, if that makes sense. And then, when it feels like it all might become a little too much, you just get these phenomenal guitar lines played on the Ebo that just drone so spectacularly and so beautifully. And man, it's a wonderful build-up to that this point, across not just in the song, but even on the whole album. You've got all this fear and tension, and you're building up to this. And I feel like there's something so beautiful about this one, having had those drones build up so much, and having just, you just end up with these like beautiful loops and hummed vocals, and it's just a wonderfully glorious and wonderful moment on this track. Then of course though, having built up the drone, they once again do that thing, they fade away their layers again, don't they? And then you're just sort of left with the guitars feedbacking into the distance, and I would say it kind of builds into, a Windy and Carl type drone, if that makes sense. You get this lovely bass note that's pushing it along as the Ebos continue to just build and build. And then, eventually you're given another reintroduction of acoustic folk instruments, they start to play as well, and it feels so much more frenetic and manic at this point, with distortion starting to build up in this really odd but peculiar and gentle way, if that makes sense. And it's like the wind is still blowing rapidly all around us though, but we finally arrived where we needed to be, standing above it, looking over the vast empty distance towards the horizon, just taking in nature and everything for what it is. And I have to say, I think this is a favourite of mine. It might be my favourite one. It just has this beautifully gentle pace to it, even And after so much of the intimidation from the earlier tracks, it's nice having something like this here, I mean, it still has its own elements of turmoil and frenzy, but there's just something so beautiful about it, though, and it has so much character, even when it becomes so noisy and distorted at the end, but there's just something so brilliant about it, And I have to say as well, the final moments on this one are very interesting, because the drones seem to have devolved into this noisy feedback, and I'm pretty certain of this, that there is an effect happening that happens on the Boss DD20 Giga delay effect, where, the delay pedal just creates this feedback loop, and it just becomes very lo-fi and distorted, and I'm pretty sure this has happened to me before when just experimenting with the pedal itself. But I'm pretty sure that's what's happening here. I might be wrong, but it might be that. I don't know. I don't know. Let's just move on. Let's move on, though. We move on to the track "Will You Die for Me." So it seems, after the whole Daughters of Darkness album, after we're onto disc 4 now. It's taken a long time to get here, but I would argue after discs 1, 2 and 3 especially, it seems that disc 4 might be seen as the one disc of respite on this whole thing. Bear with me on that. It's really weird to consider it, especially considering how dark and macabre the whole thing is, but also considering how this track, I think this one's likely named after a book of the same name by one Charles Tex Weston, which is a book about Charles Manson. Take that as you will. Which means there is a very dark and sinister background to so much of the composition on this one. But after the really intimidating Slaves for the Afterlife, followed by the gorgeous Black Pastures, we end up at Will You Die For Me, which is perhaps one of the most beautiful and gentle compositions across the whole Daughter of Darkness experience. And, it's so weird, you're greeted with this almost gentle, whimsical guitar chords gliding across the channels, backed up by the customary drones of the EBOs, of course, and they're playing rather high-pitched frequencies, what I assume are notes played much higher on the fretboard. And all in all, after everything we've experienced up to this point, it becomes this very beautiful moment on the album, though. And yet it still feels so much in the same vein as everything we've been undergoing, but maybe just a little bit more gentle, if that makes sense. It's very confusing to think about, very odd indeed. But yeah, even when those chords fade out, to let the elongated drones take the forefront, there's still this very odd and gentle charm to the whole composition, and as such is perhaps one of my favourites. And much like the previous track, this one also reminds me of Windy and Carl, and with this one especially, it really reminds me of the romantic quality you find in Windy and Carl's music. And interestingly enough, the same way that our commentator was reminded of on Shalabi effect of natural snow building and was really pleased that they're reminded of natural snow buildings. I'm very pleased that I'm reminded of Windy and Carl, because they're without a doubt one of my favourite bands of all time. I adore their music. It's just, oh man, just beautiful music. But going into a bit though, talking a bit more about this romantic quality, you can bear with me on this. I've made a very peculiar. I'm going to call this a tangent, to be fair, but let's see how this goes. You can kind of infer a bit of the romantic quality from the name itself, which, in a way, almost comes across as excessive, right? Bordering on the weird paradoxical nature of romanticism expressed in songs like "I'll Follow You Into the Dark" by Death Cab for Cutie. Rather dramatic and over the top as a sentiment, but it perhaps expresses the notion of how far would you go for me, will you die for me, essentially, which is really dark but interesting. I mean, to be fair, when I wrote that, I didn't know about the whole Charles Manson thing, so I feel like this is all new. But regardless though, I find it interesting because this track does express to me this really odd, beautiful romanticism for some reason, and I don't know why now, to be fair. If anything, I'm more confused about it. But there's still something so pleasant and gorgeous about this one, and as well, as it builds and builds on though, as it progresses on, the drones get so much more intense as they hold on to specific notes. But you hear them as they morph and change with the various effects that they're being pulled through the various pedals, of course. But it never becomes overbearing or intimidating like any of the previous tracks though. At least for me, I would argue. But I would also add, this is perhaps one of the most lo-fi compositions on the whole thing. And then it should be said, there's a couple of instances of peaking of certain frequencies that find a way into the track, and this is, I think, due to the lo-fi nature of so much of what they do as a band. There's no mixing and stuff, it's just play the music, let it be what it is. And I feel like elements like that, it's kind of odd, but they become the very elements that are part of the whole natural buildings, snow buildings repertoire, if that makes sense. They're the very accents, the very minute details that are part of the very expression of the band's intention. And it's weird, they can technically be seen as mistakes, but they add just these little bits to the compositions, and they become all the more wonderful for it, if that makes sense. All in all, though, beautiful composition. It's dreamy, lovely, and so pleasant to hear this one. And so, we move on to disc 5, It feels like we're approaching the final stretch though, but I feel like this is perhaps where Daughter of Darkness becomes its most challenging to us as listeners, We have 4 songs to close us off now, and yet this is where we get bombarded with the longest compositions across the whole thing. And so, disc 5 opens up with Devil's Fork, which is the second longest track, clocking in at roughly 45 minutes. And this one, I feel it opens up so abstractly, so formlessly almost, as you're just given this almost lo-fi fuzzy guitar in the background, whilst the lead slowly adds, more character to it all. And I find it interesting, the abstract nature, as a Devil's Fork is apparently a name for the optical illusion of the same name, which is, man, what a brain twister to look at, right? But I feel like it's expressive of the rather abstract nature of this track itself, And this one, it's such a slow burner of a track though, with the band letting each and every element, every sound, every drone, every note occur and take as long as they feel is necessary and correct. And as the build-up continues and continues, especially when the EBOs start pummeling us with those stretched out and distorted notes, it feels as though we're approaching that tumultuous level of noise that will threaten to just break and shatter us, even though we can still hear the almost gentler elements still occurring in the background. It's like they're struggling to almost even be heard amongst the whining and the feedback of this composition. And I feel this is another really existential experience, maybe in part because of how long this one is, maybe in part of how long it's taken us to get to this point, if that makes sense. But so much of this experience of an album is so existential, it really just finds ways to pull you outside of your body, if that makes sense. It's so weird. But going into it though, as it continues to push and push though, it's roughly around 22 minutes in though, it all fades away again, natural snow buildings fade out thing, to give room to this kind of finger-picked guitar line accompanied by the screeching of the EBO again and these improvised vocal incantations. And I don't know why, but I love this section of the track though, especially when those EBOs start droning and intertwining with each other. Whilst in the background, almost you're getting faint vocalizations. And there's something so pretty and emotional about it all, And then, it's around 30 minutes into this one, you're getting another change as the percussion starts to drive it along again though, it's rattling, chiming, echoing, and gently pounding away as the guitars, become almost wild and frenzied, sliding and stretching their notes over the most, incredibly elongated drones. And once again, it's that, hypnotizing miasma, it's just so foreboding and weird. It just takes you to this really weird, terrifying territory. And yet, with how gradual these changes have actually come, you actually barely notice that you've moved into these new landscapes, if that makes sense, you know? Like, it's interesting, you'll feel like you're part of somewhere, but then the composition slowly shifts into something else, and then you become aware of it again. You're like, when did we go from there to here, if that makes sense? It's so weird how this album does that, and so many of the compositions as well. But going into it though, you know, whereas you previously had EVOs, you know, gliding over each other, you now have the Natural Snow Building's customary freeform abstract percussion, of course, offset by really intimidating and peculiar vocal drones that, once again, it sounds like trying to summon some great demon out of the cracks of the earth itself, you know, before it all just screams and shouts in some abject horror almost. And this track, you know, it particularly has... No, it's taken on such an enigmatic and phenomenal journey through sound and concepts, offering beauty and terror in equal measure across the incredibly long runtime. And it takes so long to get to this point, you know, on the album, you know, and once you're here, like, you're strapped in for one of the most darkest experiences across the whole album, I would feel, you know. It's an incredible ordeal that has the power to twist your heart into knots as it pushes onward through that miasmic terror. And so, a point I want to mention as well about this track though, before we finish talking about it. When listening to this track while writing my notes, I noticed a really peculiar thing happening on the Bandcamp player. So I don't know how this happened. I was just watching, right, and you know, the track kept playing on Bandcamp, you know, reaching the end of the 45 minutes. But to my surprise, the song kept playing, and I had never seen anything like it before, and it fills me with this weird existential terror as the song continued to play on longer than what the player was saying it should last for. Now, it's weird, as though the song was demanding to let it finish exactly, you know, it finished saying exactly what it had to say, and, you know, it'll be over when it feels it's over, you know, regardless of what is said. And what a weird thing to have experienced, but I thought that was really weird considering how existential this whole album is, right? And so moving along, we get Blood in the Ground linking us all. And this one, it starts off with a sort of flamenco acoustic strumming of sorts, you know, I don't know why I call it that, but it's just what it reminds me of, if that makes sense. You know, and it's guided over various notes and strings that create that unusual miasma that we're no doubt used to by now, right? And to be fair to this one once again reminds me of Shalabi Effect, and it's got that, you know, Shalabi Effect utilised the oud a lot, you know, traditional folk instrument, you know. And here you're getting this sort of strumming up and down in, you know, that very unusual folk style. And yet this one also is incredibly captivating as it draws you into that strange and dark world. Immediately though, you're given some incredibly beautiful vocalizations, you know, before they're interrupted by heavier strums of that guitar. And it's almost like it attacks you with its unusual presence, you know, in the recording, you know, all the while the vocalizations continuing, further reaching upwards and twisting themselves in these weird and unusual ways. And what's wonderful though in this one, what's wonderful is how you're hit with this incredibly ominous structure, you know, roughly 4 minutes or so in, when that heavy acoustic playing just takes over entirely, you know, just guiding us along to this very terrifying territory. It's backed up by that rattle and shaking of various percussive instruments and the continuing stretched out vocalizations. And it becomes so intense again, but there's an incredible beauty in how powerful this track sounds. And I would argue it feels a little bit more rhythmically structured than some of the previous tracks, if that makes sense, you know. Not a bad thing actually, like the other ones don't feel as much like that. It's just different, you know, different to the other ones for that reason. That's interesting, I feel. But of course, as you should expect by now, you know, like, you know, they once again build up layer upon layer with all those pedals, of course, you know, and you just, it's so interesting as it all builds up again. It just threatens to drown what was established in that deluge of noise and feedback. And that's of course until around 10 minutes in, the composition falls back again, and it lets those drones ring out, and the acoustics slowly build up to a much slower tempo, giving emphasis to the ringing out of the chord before it builds up to another rhythmic chant, using the percussion to drive it forward the unusual demonic beat. And this one has such a peculiar stretch of vocals, drones, and of course the woodwind that has been prevalent in so many of the tracks, but I've actually no doubt given very little credence to, but it is what it is. I'm very sorry about that. But this one, once again, it feels so ritualistic though, like dancing around the fire, banging your drum, blowing into your flute, and just droning vocalizations over the top of it all, as it just proceeds along. And what's wonderful is how, the layer upon layer is added, from the guitars to the vocals to the percussion, so on and so forth, until it just becomes this incredibly noisy and intimidating excursion. And it feels like it's threatening to, once again, just pull you apart. And that is, of course, until the layers all die down again, leaving behind the drones and vocalizations as the percussion rings out almost arrhythmically amongst the composition itself. And it's just turning it into its own frenzied expression, though, if that makes sense. It's so weird, but so interesting. And for this, parts of the drone seem to build up to tumultuous levels, squealing with discordant feedback and noise, and it sounds truly terrifying, existential, and almost incomprehensible, especially considering how long it's taken us to get to this point on the album. And perhaps this is why it just feels so overwhelming and so existential, even when the composition once again falls back to simpler drones, accompanied by this really unusual section of, like twisted notes gliding at the top of it all, whilst vocalizations descend down the register in such an unusual way. It's still so overwhelming and existential. I think it's a truly phenomenal moment on the album, especially with those vocalizations, because this one reminds me, interestingly enough, it actually reminds me of a track called By Locations by Land of Kush, which, oddly enough, is a side project from Shalabi Effect's Sam Shalabi. Like, I was very surprised that I was reminded of this, but, especially at the end of that By Locations by Land of Kush, you just have this really weird droning outro, with these really beautiful vocals that are just, like, gliding in and out and stuff. And this track really reminds me of that for some reason, and it's interesting because I think for that reason it's perhaps why this is perhaps one of my favourite tracks on the album. I find it cool that it reminds me of that, but it's also very much its own terrifying existential experience, if that makes sense. Though, don't get me wrong. But yeah, there's something truly phenomenal about this one. Though, it's easily one of my favourites, I have to say. And so, with that, we move on to the sixth and final disc on, of Daughter of Darkness. It has been an incredibly long, arduous, and difficult journey we've undertaken, and by this point, it has been complete sensory overload in so many respects, and yet there's still 75 minutes to go here. So, the final disc opens up with The Invisibles, which features this lovely acoustic melody in the background, which once again reminiscent of Shalabi Effect's Oud, no doubt. I do apologize for mentioning so many times. But with it though, you're getting these wandering vocalizations and the shaking and rattling of percussion, drums, etc., and the drones of woodwind, the very interesting sonic palette that natural snow buildings establish, and it all creates this really peculiar acoustic environment. And that is until the electronic drones brought on by the many delay pedals, the EBOs, they start off incredibly subtly and gradually on this composition, and it's just proceeding with no real sense of hurry or anything. And with that, the percussion's rattling and booming away, and the feedback of the electric drones that start to build and build up in that quintessential natural snow buildings form, right? All the while though, you've got this continuing vocalizations just floating above the top of the whole composition. And then it starts establishing this very peculiar beat of sorts, this booming sensation that rumbles, within the very mix as the drones just continue and continue, irrespective of this newly established pulse in the track. And the more they let this one build, though, the louder the composition turns, eventually until you're, just you just progress to this much more intense section in the track. And there's a part about 9 minutes in, the vocalizations in it, they've changed from the high wanderings of falsetto in favour of this much, this droning vocal again that's much lower on the register in terms of the scale. And it's still continuing those drones, the peculiar beat, but it feels so much more intense now as a result, as it also just ever so slightly just ups the tempo again. And for us, it creates this really peculiar sensation where you've slowly and gradually built to this point, both across the album and on this composition, and it's almost overwhelming to a point, but there's a beauty within that incredible intensity, if that makes sense. And it's roughly around 12 minutes in though, the guitars have done this incredibly peculiar effect, and I'm not even sure how this was achieved though. I feel like it must be some twisting of the sounds through the delay pedals, and I'm sure there must be a modulation pedal in there somewhere, I'm not too sure, but whatever it is, it's just morphing it into this incredibly peculiar and twisted note that just glides amongst the composition itself, like a spectral entity, conjured up out of thin air. And, this continues until it builds up to this incredibly intense moment where the electric guitars, they just get louder and buzzier as those EBOs, just continue to slide amongst around the notes, just droning away as they've always done, But there's some wonderful notes they hit here, though, especially around, I think it's 17 minutes in. It just lands on these incredibly impactful notes. All the while that continued looped rhythm from the very opening continues and continues to drive it all forward, before it all just fades away, letting the feedback and whine of the drones just ring out, just giving us room to breathe and recover. And what I like here, it's about just shy of around halfway through this track, is how the layers fall away, leaving only the droning guitars played by the EBO. And you get these incredibly long droning notes. The EBO just vibrates the string, and it's that you get that wonderful effect you hear when you just hold it in place there for as long as you feel is necessary. And as someone who uses the EBO a lot, this is something I adore about it, You just hold it there and the note just stretches to infinity, and you get this weird effect happening with the very note itself, where just holding it, the note is vibrating and it's just morphing and shifting ever so slightly, based on where you're holding it above the pickup, if that makes sense. It's a wonderful effect, and I'm really glad to hear it on this track, because I've been there where I've just been noodling around. You just hold it there just to hear the drone and just hear how it sounds. It's a beautiful thing. However, the song hasn't ended there, though, don't get me wrong. We're only halfway through this track, and as the drones continue their screeching, their whining, slowly backed up by more EBOs and stuff, and eventually the droning vocalization of the chorus. There's even a guitar solo on this one, I feel, of sorts maybe. I guess it could be called that. It's completely drowned in effects, and it sounds so distant within the mix, But it's a beautiful thing though, and it all leads once again to another incredibly slow and gradual build-up of droning layers and incredibly intense sounding guitar layers, before it just reaches a point where, once again, it's just dying in this deluge of feedback and high-pitched frequencies. And you're getting these stretched, distorted notes just climbing up towards the stratosphere, and all the while this incredibly subtle rattle of some kind of percussion is creating this incredibly slow tempo amongst the tumultuous noise. And it's an incredibly intense moment on the track, and it leads into this wonderful procession for the final few minutes. And it's where the percussion just establishes this very unusual beat, where it just hits the beat, then rattles briefly, and it's such an interesting motif to end this track on, I feel. It perfectly pushes along those drones, and that are still just whining so loudly in your headphones. But it all just morphs and shifts for the final few minutes, though. And for me, it just becomes this weird, almost out-of-body experience for the final stretch of the track, though. A brilliant ending to, once again, one of the album's best tracks, I feel, And then, yeah, it took so long to get here, but as a result, this might perhaps be one of the most rewarding tracks on the whole of Door Through Darkness, though. The fact it takes you hours to get to this point means that the experience of listening to it is truly rewarding as a result, if that makes sense. And so we move on. We move on to the final track of Daughter of Darkness, and that is Psychic Navigation. And this one, it immediately opens up with the tones of Ebo drones and a sort of folky flair, maybe reminiscent of classical Indian folk, I don't know. Anyway, this is what the album's built up towards, so the final track, which is 32 minutes to bring this whole thing to a close. And this one is incredibly dreamy, ethereal, and almost psychedelic as the drones kind of oscillate around, just going wob, wob, wob as they're caught in a filter that's manipulating the notes in such a weird and peculiar way. And it creates for us a rather cosmic experience, though. It's, like I said, almost psychedelic, which makes sense given the name of the track, of course. And it doesn't take long for this one, for the drones to stop, doing that thing of screeching and whining, of course. Running through the pedals on such peculiar settings, just twisting and morphing into really peculiar characters. But what I like is how there's, even with that confusion and chaos, there's a weird comforting presence of what's being heard here. And yep, the composition, it does climb, soar and reach those high-pitched frequencies, but it also indulges in those much lower registers as well, and it creates for this wonderful experience to just drift off to. And even when the track builds up though, it still feels so wonderfully comfortable in its own weird way. And I feel that maybe it's comfortable due in part to how overwhelming how so much of this album has been, if that makes sense, and how long it's taken to get here. There's something pleasant amongst the confusing chaos, if that sense. And as a result, this is a lovely track to listen to though. I love how intense the drones become towards the middle of the track, where they just let the guitar screech away in phenomenal fashion though. And of course, as you should expect by now, the composition fades away, it removes its layers, brings down the volume to just allow just those screeching drones to have a little bit of presence, occupying the forefront of the composition whilst, more drones are still there in the background, basically. And there's some really satisfying effects being heard here, though, especially when the delay pedals just pings notes and bounces them around the place, though. And what's nice again is that peculiar oscillating wubby sound, whatever you want to call it from the beginning. I don't know what it is, but it comes back in at around 20 minutes in, and it brings us back to that psychedelic setting of this one though. And to me, it gives it a very existential feeling, as though we've literally transported ourselves to the fourth dimension or something, and you've ascended out of this plane of existence, you're just, especially after sitting through the whole album, of course, right? You're just left there, sitting there absorbing the very chaotic nature of the track as it just continues to push forward, onwards and onwards as the drones just continue to screech through. And as a result, it's a beautiful one though. It's very interesting. And especially when you get to the final few minutes though, they do a lovely thing where the drones are screeching again, the layers are fading away, but you're getting these beautiful vocalizations though from the both of them just singing away as the album is drawing itself to its close. And what a lovely way to end this album, I think, It ends it on this very pleasant existential note that still retains so many of the qualities of the entire album itself. And as those vocals continue, as the drones continue, it just ends. And then there's a few seconds of silence as the album ends. And then it's over. And man, if you are just left there, sitting there, contemplating the whole thing in those final few seconds of silence, and my goodness, what an album. To be honest, there are so many aspects of this album that are just impossible for me to put into words, I feel. It's such an exhausting and overwhelming album experience that explores a multitude of emotions across its many tracks, and so many tracks just strike this incredible fear into me, whilst others leave me with this incredible melancholy beauty. But overall, it becomes this phenomenal listening experience as a result. That's one of the most unique things I've ever come across, ever been introduced to. I'm sorry. And it's without a doubt one of the most ambitious album releases I've ever heard of. And ever since I was introduced to it, it's been playing on my mind consistently over this entire year. However, there's actually a bit more to this record than what we've got on the Bandcamp page and what we have discussed for the past hour, it seems. So, we've been covering the release of Daughter of Darkness released on Bada Bing Records. The vinyl release, the CD release, the 6 CDs, the digital version. However, although this re-release really nicely compiled so much of the material which was sourced from the original cassette release of Daughter of Darkness, which we will get into in a bit, it actually opted to cut out a couple of songs, which I find very interesting. And so we're going to talk about them. Let's discuss the missing tracks on Daughter of Darkness, shall we? So, the original Daughter of Darkness was released on 5 cassettes, tapes 1 to 4, and then tape O with a slash in it. I don't know how it's described. And this makes up the original release of the album then, which was followed up by Daughter of Darkness 5 a couple of months later. And so this version of the album, it has a different ordering of the tracks and even differing lengths to the tracks than what was presented on the re-release, what is available on the Bandcamp page. And I find stuff like this very interesting, as changing around the ordering makes the whole thing, express itself a little bit differently in certain ways, But more importantly, there's 3 tracks, that didn't make it onto the re-release. 1 from the original Daughter of Darkness release, and 2 from the follow-up of Daughter of Darkness 5. And I find this interesting, as I didn't know about this until I started researching for this, and I listened to these tracks, and they are incredibly interesting little compositions. And so on an album that's already so long, what difference would an extra 20 minutes have really made, right? But in any case, I'm sure, Natural Snow Buildings, Bada Bing Records, they had their reasons for not wanting to include this, right? I would actually assume it might be to do with the vinyl release of this, perhaps. But regardless, I feel as though these are part of the Daughter of Darkness canon, and thus we're going to quickly discuss them. So, the track missing from the original cassette release, called Left for Dead. This 2-minute track pulsates with a rather gentle airy drone, just going up and down with this little motif. And oddly, this one feels incredibly ambient, and it's a lovely little track that was removed from the main version of Daughter of Darkness, that we're so much more familiar with by now, right? And although it was only available on the original cassette version, I find it to perhaps be one of the most lightest and gentlest moments across the entirety of Daughter of Darkness. And, I find it so odd that Bada Bing, couldn't find any way, shape, or any place to put this incredibly short track onto it. But maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe this track is a little bit too gentle for what, NSB and Bada Bing wanted to do with the re-release, And perhaps it kind of, breaks the overall structure of it a little, but it's actually a really beautiful little composition though, and I think if it was placed within the re-release, it would create a real true moment of respite that's maybe needed, especially towards the end of it perhaps, but, it's a point of contention, everyone would have their opinion on it. And so the other 2 tracks from Daughters of Darkness 5, we have The Damned and The Tortured. So this one is a really interesting track, especially when compared to the entirety of Daughter of Darkness, as this one features an incredibly prominent percussion section, backed up by lovely vocalizations that float so beautifully in and amongst the composition, whilst the acoustic guitars just play these incredibly peculiar notes that have become naturally distorted by the very nature of how it's being played and the lo-fi recording of it, if that makes sense. And it's a rather sinisterly beautiful composition, and it's a rather short little track, but there's something so lovely about this one, a lovely amalgamation of various loops from the vocals to the guitars to the persistent percussion, and I'm really surprised this one didn't make the cut in the re-release, but like I said, I'm sure they had their reasons for it though. But this one has a very interesting vibe that I think is very interesting amongst the whole of Daughters of Darkness, though. So worth checking out, I would say. Worth checking out. And so, we move on to the final track that we're going to discuss on this show, and that is Masked Marvel, the final track of Daughters of Darkness 5. This one starts off very interestingly. It's a very low, murmuring notes, drones, acoustic riffs, and the subtle presence of woodwind. But this one feels subtle though. It lets the woodwind kind of take the forefront of the composition as it slowly works its way forwards. And you're getting that customary building of drones, of course, as it's culminating this very melancholy track, though, that feels like you're just lying there in defeat, completely destroyed by the entire experience of everything you have undergone, and you're just letting the whole thing wash over as you ruminate over the entirety of it all. But what's lovely, though, is how, this one has a really beautiful folky flair to it, I feel, and it ties in so wonderfully to everything else in the album. And much like how Psychic Navigation, was an oddly cathartic experience that the album is built towards, I feel like Masked Marvel kind of does the same thing, especially with it being the final track of it, right? It's the settling of the dust after the incredible ordeal, as it slowly builds its way to its rather intimidating ending. And it ends on a very odd, almost discordant drone, though, It makes the whole thing feel incredibly existential, though, and once again, very curious why this wasn't one on the re-release. So it would fit really comfortably within it, but it is what it is, right? And so with that, we've covered the missing material, and it really piques my curiosity why these particular tracks were cut from it. But as mentioned, I'm sure they had their reasons, right? But as said, this is part of the Daughter of Darkness lore. I would be remiss if I did not mention these 3 different tracks because it's a part of the story, right? And what I like as well about it, the fact they were cut, it kind of just brings, certain sense of mystique and mystery to it all, something else for us to ponder upon, basically. So, there's, a couple of last things I want to discuss, before we finish this video. It's taken so long to get here in the video as well, but, there's a lot I want to discuss here, which is why this is so long, right? So one very important thing I feel we need to discuss is the album's artwork, of course, right? So I have this terrible habit of just completely forgetting to talk about artworks for so many of the albums I review, despite artworks actually being one of the things I love about album releases. In any case, Daughter of Darkness has some of the most incredibly striking album art that is just impossible to ignore. The face peering from the darkness, staring at something in the distance with the red highlights upon their lips and eyes. There's something so visually terrifying and engrossing about this particular artwork that I feel perfectly encapsulates the very notions and themes of the album itself. And it's something that evokes the feelings of a horror film, It's so dark and foreboding, and it's even scary on some levels, But I'm very appreciative of that, especially, I'm appreciative of any album art that perfectly goes hand in hand with the very album it's representing. And I feel that Daughter of Darkness is one of the finest examples of this. Every time I look at this picture, I'm filled with this odd sense of dread, and it's a weirdly existential thing. But there's something truly brilliant about it, right? Truly brilliant about it. And so, we are eventually approaching the end of this incredibly long review. To be honest, how do you even begin to summarize something like this, This whole thing, being a 7.5 hour long endurance test of sorts, it really puts you through this incredible experience from start to end. And you get this impactful emotional resonance that you just feel deep within your very soul when you listen to this thing, and it's so demanding of your time and attention. And so many of the tracks, they just climb to these tumultuous and terrifyingly loud parts, that are so intimidating and just, terrifying to behold. But you do get these gentle parts, scattered in it, But they are present. They're here and there, and they do offer some respite as you crawl along the album experience, and it's so existential as a result, though. It's so weird but so interesting. And so before I finish, there's a couple of things. One more thing I want to mention. This album, like the moment I was introduced to it, it really drew me in for so many reasons. And I still remember listening to this album for the first time, and I remember being enthralled by the sheer scale of this thing, as well as just how the album sounds, right? And in my discovery of natural snow building thanks to our commenter and how they do things, I ended up discovering a lot of things about the way they compose their music that really surprised me. And that is, mostly in part due to the pedals they use, that the band uses in their compositions, as well as their extensive use of EBOs. And what I like about it, especially in terms of how it sounds, they use a large variety of loopers, delay pedals, and reverbs, and these are, I would call this a much more advanced version of the kind of things that I like to do, basically, when I play guitar. And believe me, I even have the same pedal. I have the DD 20 Giga delay pedal, which is, without a doubt, my favourite pedal I have on my guitar board, because it is a phenomenal pedal that does so many little things, and it was also the pedal that really opened up my understanding of what you can do with them, if that makes sense. And to see, to see it on Natural Snowbuilding's rig, that is really cool in my eyes. That is so cool. But yet in discovering it, so much of the sonic palette that the band have just makes so much more sense. The way the pedals and EBOs shape the texture of the drones, as well as allowing for such abstract improvisation as well. I think it's really neat, it was one of the things, when I first heard the album, prior to any research, there was this odd sense of familiarity to so many sounds on the album, which is incredibly pretentious to say, but I just thought it was so interesting, and it's one of the main reasons why I was drawn into this album, if that makes sense, especially with it being lo-fi as well. It kind of makes sense, to be fair, but, it is what it is. But yeah, with that then, I think we're going to come to the end of this episode of Weird Music, and what a trip this has been, right? I have no idea how this video is going to end up, but that's what I find fun about making these things, As I said, what an album this is. This is easily one of my favourite things I've been introduced to, and I'm really glad I was introduced to this through the whole Weird Music thing, right? So, huge thanks to our commenter, MaryFreeGirl2029, for letting me know about this one. To be fair, it wasn't a suggestion, but as soon as I heard it, I knew I wanted to talk about this one, because as this is a truly exceptional album experience. It's one that will stick me, forever, right? And so, I would like to, if you're still watching this, I would like to personally thank you, yes, you, for watching this really long episode of Weird Music. And yep, if you're still watching, and you are all familiar with Daughter of Darkness, then let me know in the comments what your favourite track on the entire thing is then, I think for me it might be Black Pastures. I just love the vibe of that one. But yep, thank you so much for watching this episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.